Before we talk about the house, we need to correct the family story, my daughter-in-law said as she placed a stack of papers on the table between my son and me. In that moment, I realized this lunch was never meant to heal anything. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed that no one could take away a lifetime of memories. I was wrong. The diner sat just off a quiet highway outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where retired couples shared pie and coffee on weekday afternoons. Daniel had called 2 days earlier and asked if we could meet. His voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "Just the two of us, Mom," he had said. "We need to talk. I spent far too long deciding what to wear." That may sound foolish, but when your husband has been gone for 3 years and your only child rarely calls anymore, a simple lunch can begin to feel important. I chose a navy blue sweater Henry always liked and drove 30 minutes through light autumn rain, believing this might be the start of something better. Daniel was already seated when I arrived. He stood and hugged me, but only briefly. There was a stiffness in him I couldn't ignore. His smile appeared and disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. We ordered coffee. We talked about the weather. We talked about traffic. We talked about everything except whatever had brought us there. Then the bell above the entrance door chimed. I turned and saw Vanessa walking toward us. My stomach tightened immediately. She wasn't supposed to be there. Daniel looked down at the table instead of meeting my eyes. That was the first moment I knew something was wrong. Vanessa sat beside him and offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. She carried a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Without ordering anything, without asking how I was doing, she opened the folder and carefully removed several printed pages. Then she slid them onto the table. "Before we talk about the house," she said calmly, "we need to correct the family story." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The waitress arrived with our coffee, unaware that the air around our booth had suddenly become heavy. I looked at Daniel. He stared at the papers. I looked back at Vanessa. "What does that mean?" I asked. She folded her hands together. "It means certain things have been remembered incorrectly for years." Her voice remained soft, controlled, practiced. "And before any decisions are made, Daniel deserves the full truth." The full truth. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because Henry and I had spent 40 years building a family based on honesty, sacrifice, and loyalty. Yet somehow I had become a stranger sitting across from my own son while someone else prepared to explain my life to him. My eyes dropped to the first page. Near the top was a sentence that made my heart sink. It described me as controlling, cold, emotionally distant. The words blurred for a moment. Not because I doubted myself, but because I recognized exactly what I was looking at. Someone had spent a very long time rewriting the past. And judging by the silence from my son, he had already started believing it. I did not respond right away. Instead, I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and watched the steam rise between us. The diner suddenly felt quieter than before, as if every sound had moved farther away. Vanessa sat perfectly still, her posture straight, her expression calm. Daniel remained focused on the papers lying on the table. He still could not look directly at me. That hurt more than anything written on those pages. There was a time when my son told me everything. When he was 8 years old, he would sit at our kitchen counter after school and describe every detail of his day while I prepared dinner. When he was 16, he would come to me whenever life felt confusing. When he was 25 and preparing to marry Vanessa, he called me almost every evening asking for advice about work, money, and the future. Looking at him now, I felt as though I was sitting across from a stranger wearing my son's face. Vanessa gently tapped one of the pages. "This is not meant to hurt anyone," she said. "It is simply about being honest." Honest. The words settled heavily in my chest. I glanced down again. The document contained examples, memories, events, conversations, small moments from years ago that had somehow been transformed into evidence against me. A strict curfew became emotional control. Encouraging Daniel to finish college became pressure. Asking him to call his father during difficult times became manipulation. I could hardly believe what I was reading. Yet what frightened me most was not the content itself. It was the realization that somebody had spent months, perhaps years, carefully assembling this version of reality. These distortions did not appear overnight. They had been built slowly, piece by piece, like bricks forming a wall. Suddenly, certain memories began returning to me. Family dinners where Vanessa would casually correct details of old stories. Holiday gatherings where she would laugh and say, "That is not exactly how it happened." Birthdays where conversations somehow shifted away from shared memories and towards subtle criticisms of the past. At the time, I dismissed those moments. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself every family had misunderstandings. Now I wondered how long the process had been happening without me noticing. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was quiet. "Mom, maybe there are things we never talked about." I felt my stomach tighten. Not because he sounded angry, because he sounded uncertain. Uncertainty can be more dangerous than anger. Anger eventually burns out. Doubt stays. Doubt grows. I looked directly at him. "Daniel," I said softly, "do you believe this?" He hesitated. That pause lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Long enough for me to understand that something fundamental had changed. "I do not know what to believe anymore," he admitted. Those words landed harder than any accusation. For a moment, I could not speak. Outside the diner window, cars moved steadily through the gray afternoon. People continued their lives. Somewhere, families were gathering for dinner. Somewhere, mothers were receiving phone calls from children who still trusted them. Meanwhile, I sat across from my only son listening to him question memories I had lived myself. Vanessa folded her hands and nodded slightly, as though this uncertainty proved her point. That was when I realized the papers were not the real problem. The real problem was that the story had already been told long before I ever saw the first page. After a few minutes, the waitress returned and asked whether we needed anything else. Daniel ordered another coffee. Vanessa asked for water with lemon. I said nothing. My appetite had disappeared somewhere between the first page and the first doubt I heard in my son's voice. The papers remained spread across the table like exhibits in a trial I never knew existed. Vanessa carefully turned to another page. She spoke with the confidence of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. "There are patterns here," she said. "When people look back honestly, they start recognizing them." I noticed she kept using words like people and everyone instead of names. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Specific people could disagree. Everyone sounded permanent. Daniel slowly nodded as she spoke. Not because he fully agreed, I realized, but because he had heard these arguments before. Probably many times. The conversation was not new to him. I was simply the last person invited to it. That thought stayed with me. The last person invited to the story of my own life. I looked through the diner window again and found myself remembering another afternoon many years earlier. Daniel had been 10 years old. Henry was working late, and a thunderstorm knocked out the electricity across our neighborhood. Daniel became frightened whenever storms grew too strong. We sat together on the living room floor beneath a blanket with a flashlight and a deck of cards. I stayed awake half the night just so he would not feel alone. I remembered his small hand gripping mine every time thunder rattled the windows. That memory appeared so clearly that I could almost hear his voice. Yet according to the papers in front of me, I had supposedly been emotionally distant. The contradiction felt impossible. Vanessa continued. "Children often do not understand certain behaviors until they become adults." Daniel remained silent. I could see the conflict in his face. He was searching through years of memories while somebody else handed him a map, telling him where to look. The danger of that kind of influence is not that it creates new memories. It changes the meaning of old ones. A sacrifice becomes a burden. Protection becomes control. Concern becomes criticism. The facts remain, but the interpretation shifts. Suddenly, I remembered the months after Henry passed away. At first, Daniel called nearly every evening. Then the calls became weekly. Then every few weeks. Eventually, most conversations happened through short text messages. Whenever I suggested dinner, there always seemed to be scheduling problems. Work obligations. Travel plans. Home projects. At the time, I blamed distance and adulthood. Now I wondered whether something else had been growing during those years. Something quieter. Something far more deliberate. Vanessa slid the folder slightly closer to Daniel. "You have spent your whole life carrying expectations that were never yours," she said gently. It sounded compassionate. That was what made it effective. Some of the most damaging ideas arrive wrapped in concern. Daniel finally lifted his eyes and looked at me. For the first time that afternoon, I saw uncertainty mixed with guilt. Not resentment. Not anger. Guilt. As if a part of him knew something was wrong, but could not yet identify what. In that moment, I understood that arguing would accomplish nothing. Facts presented against feelings rarely win immediately, especially when those feelings have been carefully cultivated over time. So I quietly closed the folder, pushed it back across the table, and made a decision. If someone had spent years rewriting the story, then I needed to return to the place where the real story had been preserved. The drive home felt longer than 30 minutes. Rain tapped softly against my windshield as Ohio farmland rolled past in muted shades of brown and gold. I barely noticed any of it. My thoughts stayed fixed on the folder sitting in the passenger seat. I had not thrown it away. I had not torn it apart. Instead, I carried it home because I wanted to understand exactly how someone had managed to rearrange an entire lifetime into something unrecognizable. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had. The white porch railing Henry painted every spring. The maple tree he planted the year Daniel was born. The brass mailbox we argued about for 2 weeks because he insisted on installing it himself. Everything remained where it belonged. For a moment, I stood in the driveway and stared at the house. It occurred to me that buildings remember differently than people do. Walls do not reinterpret conversations. They simply witness them. Inside, the familiar quiet greeted me. Ever since Henry passed away, silence had become its own presence in the house. Not an enemy, not even sadness anymore, just a companion. I hung my coat near the front door and walked toward the hallway closet. There was something I had not opened in almost 2 years. The wooden chest sat exactly where I left it. Henry built it during one winter when Daniel was away at college. He claimed every family needed a place to keep its history. At the time, I laughed and called him sentimental. Now I wondered if he had been wiser than I realized. I knelt beside the chest and lifted the lid. The scent of old paper drifted upward immediately. On top rested photo albums, neatly stacked and labeled in Henry's careful handwriting. Beneath them sat greeting cards, letters, school programs, newspaper clippings, and dozens of small pieces of ordinary life that most people eventually forget. I opened the first album. There was Daniel at age 6 holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was. Henry stood beside him smiling proudly. The next page showed Daniel's middle school science fair. Another showed his high school graduation. I turned page after page, not searching for evidence, simply remembering. Yet something caught my attention. Tucked between 2 photographs was a folded note written in Daniel's handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. I unfolded it carefully. It was from his freshman year of college. Mom, thank you for always answering the phone no matter what time I call. I know I do not say it enough, but I could not have gotten through this year without you. I read the note twice, then a third time. The words felt strangely important now, not because they proved anything to anyone else, because they reminded me that memories recorded in the moment often tell a different story than memories rewritten years later. As evening settled outside, I continued sorting through the chest. Every item seemed to connect to another. Birthday cards, family vacation photographs, handwritten letters, pieces of a life that existed long before anyone decided to reinterpret it. Then near the bottom, beneath several old folders, I found something I had completely forgotten. A sealed envelope with Henry's handwriting across the front. Beneath my name, he had written a second sentence. Keep this safe. One day it may matter more than you think. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening the envelope. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the maple tree, casting long shadows across the backyard Henry loved so much. My fingers rested on the sealed flap while memories drifted through my mind. Henry had never been dramatic. He was the kind of man who fixed things quietly, paid attention when nobody noticed, and prepared for problems long before they appeared. If he had written that note, there was a reason. I finally opened it and carefully unfolded the pages inside. The letter was dated 6 months before he passed away. The first lines immediately brought tears to my eyes, not because they were sad, but because they sounded exactly like him. Calm, thoughtful, certain. He wrote about our marriage, about the house, about the years we spent building a family together. He wrote about Daniel. Most of all, he wrote about truth. One sentence caught my attention immediately. Memories are precious because they belong to the people who live them. Never allow anyone else to claim ownership of yours. I read that sentence several times. Then I continued. Henry described family photographs stored in the chest. He referenced old letters Daniel had written throughout childhood and college. He even listed dates attached to specific family events. It almost felt as though he had anticipated that one day someone might question what really happened. By the time I finished reading, the house had become completely dark except for the lamp above the table. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside me. For the first time since leaving the diner, I felt something other than confusion. I felt steady. Then my phone rang. The screen showed a name I had not expected. Emily. My granddaughter rarely called without texting first. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Grandma, are you busy?" she asked. "Not at all," I said. There was a brief silence. "I heard you met with Dad and Vanessa today." My heart skipped slightly. "How did you hear that?" Another pause. "Because Mom has been talking about it for weeks." Weeks. The words settled heavily in my mind. Emily lowered her voice. "Grandma, I probably should not be saying this, but I think you deserve to know. Mom has been telling everyone stories about the family for a long time now. Every holiday, every gathering, every time someone brings up the past." I closed my eyes. Suddenly, dozens of small moments began connecting together. Conversations that shifted strangely. Stories that sounded slightly different each year. Details that never seemed important until now. Emily continued. "At first I thought she was just remembering things differently. But after a while it felt intentional. If someone disagreed, she would keep repeating her version until people stopped arguing." I looked down at Henry's letter resting beside me. The timing felt almost unbelievable. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked softly. Emily answered immediately. "Because I was there, Grandma. I remember those years. And some of what she says is not true." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I glanced toward the wooden chest, the photographs, the letters, and the evidence of an entire life preserved in ordinary pieces. The story was not lost. It had simply been buried beneath a louder version. And for the first time, I began to understand exactly what I needed to do next. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Purpose has a way of changing a room. I made a pot of coffee, carried a mug to the dining room table, and began organizing everything I had found inside Henry's chest. Photographs went into one pile, letters into another, school records, family cards, and handwritten notes each found their place. By noon, the table looked less like a dining room and more like an archive of an entire life. What surprised me most was not the amount of material. It was the consistency. Year after year, the same themes appeared. Love, support, encouragement, family. None of it matched the version described inside Vanessa's folder. Around 2 o'clock, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Emily stood on the porch holding 2 paper bags from a local bakery. Her smile looked nervous. "I thought you might need company," she said. We settled into the kitchen with coffee and cinnamon rolls. At first we talked about ordinary things. Her classes, her friends, the unusually warm fall weather. Eventually her eyes drifted toward the stacks of photographs spread across the dining room. "You really kept everything," she said. I laughed softly. "Apparently your grandfather did." Emily walked over and picked up a photograph from one of the albums. It showed Daniel at age 12 standing beside a Pinewood Derby car he had spent weeks building with Henry. "I remember this picture," she said. "Dad used to tell me that Grandpa stayed up until midnight helping him finish it." She paused. "Mom tells a different story now." I looked up. "What story?" Emily hesitated. "She says Grandpa always put work first and that Dad mostly raised himself." The words hung in the air between us. Not because they made me angry, because they sounded so completely disconnected from reality. Henry had coached Little League, attended school concerts, driven Daniel to college visits across 3 states. There were photographs of all of it sitting 10 feet away. Emily slowly sat down across from me. "Grandma, there is something else." Her voice lowered. "Mom has been talking about all of this for much longer than you think." I remained silent. Emily leaned back in her chair and stared out the kitchen window for a moment. "Actually, it started years ago." I waited. "Do you remember Thanksgiving 2 years ago?" she asked. I nodded. "Mom told everyone you refused to help with dinner because you thought the food was not good enough." I frowned. That Thanksgiving, I had spent nearly 6 hours baking pies and preparing side dishes because Vanessa specifically asked me to help. Emily continued. "Then there was Dad's birthday last year. She told relatives you skipped the party because you were upset about not being the center of attention." I felt a slow ache settle in my chest. I remembered that week clearly. I had missed the celebration because I was recovering from pneumonia and my doctor advised me to stay home. Emily shook her head. Every story changed a little. Nothing huge. Just enough to make people see you differently. She looked down at her coffee. At first I thought it was accidental. After a while, I realized it never went in the other direction. Suddenly dozens of small memories began fitting together. Family barbecues, holiday gatherings, casual conversations. Tiny adjustments repeated over and over until they became accepted as truth. Then Emily reached into her purse and showed me a photograph she had taken during one of Vanessa's planning meetings. Most of the writing on the whiteboard had been erased, but one phrase remained visible near the corner. Future family legacy. I stared at those words for a long time. In that moment, I finally understood. The story itself was never the destination. The story was the road, and someone had been paving it for years. 3 days later, Daniel called. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know. His voice sounded careful, as though every word had been weighed before he spoke it. He told me that Vanessa was organizing a family gathering the following Saturday. Several relatives would attend. A few close family friends would be there as well. He said everyone thought it would be a good opportunity to discuss the future. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in the dining room staring at the folders spread across the table. Future, legacy, healing, different words, the same destination. During the following days, I kept thinking about something Emily had said. Stories do not change overnight. They change one conversation at a time. The more I thought about it, the more clearly I could see how it had happened. Over the past 3 years, Vanessa had quietly become the organizer of nearly every family event. Birthdays, holiday dinners, graduation celebrations, summer cookouts, neighborhood gatherings. If invitations went out, Vanessa sent them. If someone needed family news, Vanessa usually shared it. If plans changed, Vanessa was the one everyone called. Somewhere along the way, people stopped noticing how much influence that gave her. By the time Saturday arrived, most relatives had already heard pieces of the story. Not all at once. A comment here, a concern there, a memory adjusted slightly, an explanation offered at exactly the right moment. Never enough to trigger an argument, just enough to create doubt. That was the part one had missed. Nobody had been asked to reject me. They had simply been encouraged to question me. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm temperatures for late October. I spent the morning reviewing the folders one final time. Not because I planned to argue, because I wanted to remind myself of something important. The truth does not become stronger when repeated. It simply remains true. Around 4 o'clock, I drove to Daniel and Vanessa's house. Cars already lined both sides of the street when I arrived. Through the front windows, I could see people gathering in small groups. Laughter drifted through the open doorway. Conversations paused briefly when I entered. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Vanessa greeted me immediately. Her smile looked polished and welcoming. "Margaret, I am so glad you came," she said warmly. Anyone watching would have assumed we shared a wonderful relationship. That was one of Vanessa's greatest strengths. She understood appearances better than most people understood reality. The room filled steadily over the next hour. Cousins, friends, neighbors. Emily arrived and quietly sat beside me. Daniel moved through the crowd speaking politely, but appearing distracted. Every so often, I caught him looking toward me before quickly looking away. Eventually, Vanessa stepped into the center of the room and asked everyone for their attention. Conversations faded. Chairs shifted. Glasses were set down. Vanessa thanked everyone for coming. Then she began speaking about family, about growth, about healing, about creating healthier patterns for future generations. The language sounded thoughtful and reasonable. That was what made it effective. She never accused anyone directly. She simply described a version of the past where certain people had carried burdens and others had caused them. Several relatives nodded as she spoke. They were not responding to evidence. They were responding to a story they had already heard in pieces. Then Vanessa invited Daniel to speak. The room became completely silent. Daniel stood slowly and began talking about family memories. Some sounded familiar. Others felt strangely altered. Not false exactly, just rearranged. The meaning had changed while the events remained. When he finally sat down, Vanessa looked around the room with quiet confidence. Then her eyes settled on me. "Margaret," she said gently, "if there is anything you would like to add, now would be the perfect time." Across the room, every face turned toward me. Slowly, I placed my hand on the folder beside my chair and realized this moment had been planned long before any invitation was ever sent. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. I looked around slowly, taking in the faces of people I had known for decades. Some appeared curious, others uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Vanessa remained standing near the fireplace, her expression calm and confident. She believed the evening had already reached its conclusion. The story had been told. All that remained was for everyone else to accept it. I stood and picked up the leather folder from beside my chair. "I do have something to add," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger had disappeared sometime during the past week while I sat among photographs, letters, and memories. What remained was certainty. I opened the folder and removed a single photograph. "This was taken in 1997, I said. I held it up for everyone to see. Several relatives leaned forward immediately. The photograph showed Daniel standing beside a homemade science fair project while Henry and I stood behind him. All three of us were smiling. According to the version of events we have heard tonight, Daniel spent much of his childhood unsupported and alone. I paused. Yet this was one of dozens of weekends his father and I spent helping him prepare for school competitions. I set the photograph on the coffee table. Then I placed another beside it. And another. A fishing trip. A graduation ceremony. A family camping vacation. Ordinary moments. Real moments. The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. I reached into the folder again and removed several folded letters. "These are not my words," I said. "They belong to Daniel." I unfolded the first letter and read aloud a short passage written during his freshman year of college. The words thanked me for answering late-night phone calls, offering advice, and helping him through difficult semesters. A second letter thanked Henry for never missing baseball games. A third described our home as the place where he always felt safe. As I read, I noticed subtle changes around the room. Expressions softened. Heads tilted. People were no longer listening to competing opinions. They were listening to evidence created years before any disagreement existed. Across the room, Emily sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Daniel stared at the letters as though seeing them for the first time. Vanessa shifted her weight slightly, but said nothing. I continued. "Memory can be imperfect," I said. "We all forget details. We all see events differently. But there is a difference between remembering differently and replacing reality." Nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Not tense. Reflective. Then I reached into the folder one final time and removed Henry's letter. My fingers rested on the paper for a moment before I began reading. The room grew even quieter as his familiar voice seemed to return through the words he left behind. He wrote about family, about honesty, about protecting what mattered. And then I read the sentence that had stayed with me since the night I opened the envelope. "Memories are precious because they belong to the people who live them. Never allow anyone else to claim ownership of yours." When I finished, I lowered the letter. No one moved. No one rushed to speak. The room sat suspended in a silence that felt larger than the house itself. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I could see uncertainty appearing somewhere other than my side of the room. The silence lingered long after I lowered Henry's letter. Nobody rushed to fill it. For months, perhaps years, conversations had been guided by interpretations, assumptions, and carefully repeated stories. Now the room contained something different. Photographs, letters, school programs, birthday cards, pieces of a life recorded long before anyone had a reason to defend it. Daniel finally stood. The movement startled several people because nobody expected him to speak first. He picked up one of the letters from the coffee table and stared at it for a long moment. "I remember writing this," he said quietly. His voice sounded smaller than before, more honest. He read several lines silently and shook his head. "I completely forgot about this." Nobody answered. The room remained still. Daniel picked up another letter, then another. Each one seemed to pull him farther away from the version of events he had been repeating. Across the room, Vanessa shifted slightly. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. "Nobody is saying those moments did not happen," she said carefully. "People can remember the same experiences differently." It was a reasonable statement. Under other circumstances, I might have agreed. But that was not what everyone had just witnessed. The issue was not memory. It was replacement. Before I could respond, Emily stood. Every face turned toward her. "That is true," she said calmly. But that is not what happened here. Vanessa looked surprised. Emily rarely challenged anyone publicly. I have listened to these conversations for years, she continued. Every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner. The stories changed a little each time. Not enough for people to notice. Just enough to make Grandma seem like someone she was not. The room fell silent again. Then something unexpected happened. My cousin Linda spoke up. She remembered the camping trip shown in one of the photographs. A family friend remembered Henry coaching Daniel's baseball team. Another relative remembered how often our house became the gathering place for birthdays and holidays. One by one, people began sharing their own memories. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. They simply remembered. The effect was powerful. The truth did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through accumulation. Small memories. Independent memories. Memories that connected naturally because they were real. Daniel listened to every word. Eventually, he looked directly at me. It was the first time all evening he had done so without hesitation. "Mom," he said softly, "I think I stopped trusting my own memories." I felt my throat tighten, but I remained calm. "That can happen when someone else keeps explaining your life to you," I replied. Daniel nodded slowly. A few guests began exchanging thoughtful looks. Others stared quietly at the photographs spread across the room. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Not hostile, not divided, honest. As the evening drew to a close, people gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Several relatives stopped to hug me. A few apologized for assumptions they never questioned. Others simply thanked me for sharing the letters. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. She never admitted wrongdoing. She never offered an explanation. But she stopped speaking for everyone else. Outside, Daniel walked me to my car. The autumn air felt cool and clean. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he hugged me. This time there was no hesitation. "I am sorry," he whispered. 2 weeks later, he came to my house alone. We spent nearly 5 hours going through old albums, letters, and photographs. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he grew quiet. Mostly, he listened. Over the following months, relationships slowly changed. Some relatives apologized. Others admitted they had repeated stories without asking where they came from. And for the first time in years, family memories belonged to the people who had actually lived them. Every autumn, the maple tree Henry planted still covers my yard with gold leaves. Sometimes Daniel helps me rake them. Sometimes Emily joins us. We talk. We remember. And nobody tells us what those memories are supposed to mean anymore.